Good evening, everyone. I'm Neha Makol. I am a research scholar from Department of Science, University of Delhi, India. And today I'm going to present my paper on my study, Adapting to Global Carbon Policies, Economic Impact of Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism on Indian Businesses. I did this study along with my supervisors, Dr. Puja Gupta, who is a professor at Department of Resource Management and Design Application, Lady Irwin College, University of Delhi, India, and Dr. Meenakshi Mital, who's also a professor in the same department of Lady Irwin College, University of Delhi, and Professor Matt Syal, who is a professor in School of Planning, Design, and Construction in Michigan State Universities. So to start with a brief background to my study was to understand the impact of carbon pricing and different approaches which have been used historically by different countries of carbon pricing, and what eventually is the impact of this new carbon pricing measure, which is CBAM, on in the Indian context. So carbon pricing is basically a market-based strategy where you are putting a price on the total emissions which are produced from a product. So the idea is really to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by assigning a monetary value to the release of carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases. So what this basically encourages encourages industries and sectors to shift to more cleaner and sustainable practices. So it makes greenhouse gas emission more expensive, and they eventually have to adopt some practices because they don't want to pay that much kind of money through these carbon pricing tools. The idea is to really reflect the true cost of emissions and creating a financial incentives for the businesses to innovate and reduce their footprint, their carbon footprint. And the cost benefit, some of the core benefits of carbon pricing includes that it internalizes the environmental cost, because if there is no carbon pricing, the broader cost related to social and environmental issues and for example, climate change, health issues, ecosystem degradations are not taken into account in market transactions. It also leads to more market efficiency. So when you are attaching a financial cost to emissions, the carbon pricing is really helping the market forces to determine the most efficient pathways to reduce pollution. And it also leads to innovation, because eventually the businesses and the industries would have to invest in more cleaner technologies, look at technologies like renewable power, or go for energy efficiency, or basically just adopt low carbon processes. It also leads to revenue generation for government. So because when you are putting a cost burden on the industries, eventually it generates a significant amount of revenue which can be used in efforts which are directed towards renewable power generation or towards other climate change mitigation efforts. So carbon pricing has been used across countries through different approaches. Some of the two very important and the key approaches have been carbon taxes and emission trading systems. So carbon taxes is basically when you are putting a flat rate, like a proper cost on every ton of CO2 that is emitted, and you are basically directly charging the polluter for their emissions. So basically the tax is fixed, it's a flat rate, and the companies would have to adjust their operations to reduce emissions, or they will have to pay the tax. This kind of gives a clear price signal and push industries to integrate more effective strategies to reduce emissions into their business models. The other is like an emission trading system. It's kind of a carbon market, commonly known as cap and trade. This establishes a cap on the total amount of emissions that you would be producing across different sectors or industries. So what happens is when you put a cap, these only gives you some kind of allowances. So any industry who manages to meet that allowances will not have to pay anything, but any industry which exceeds this allowance would have to go to the market to buy more allowances. And any industry who would put in some efforts and adopt cleaner practices will be able to get issued some credits for that effort that they have made. So this is how the allowances are basically traded in a carbon trading emission system. And this is one of the most popular and most widely used approach across different countries. To understand these two approaches in more detail, I've taken two cases here. First one is of a carbon tax in India. This was implemented back in 2010. There was a coal tax of 50 rupees per metric ton of coal that was imposed on coal producers. So the idea was to reduce the emissions related to coal production, and this was of course resisted widely by the coal producers and also led to a complete unsuccessful implementation because of various reasons. So the first reason was the tax rate that was implemented was very, very low. So the companies were happy to pay that kind of tax rather than to adopt approaches to reduce emissions. There was also a lot of revenue misallocation. The total tax, the revenue that was generated through this tax was diverted to some projects which were not related to climate action. There was also a huge dependence on coal. So India at that time was more than 70% dependent on coal for energy production. So the sector which is so deeply reliant on coal makes it very difficult to transition to cleaner alternatives. So the government was also much more lenient in the imposition of this coal tax. And of course, there were issues related to economic pressures, because you are kind of when you are putting a carbon tax, you're placing the economic development at a lower scale than the environmental consideration. So this development priorities made it politically difficult to raise carbon taxes without slowing down the economic growth. The second case of is the European Union emission trading system. This was launched in 2005 by EU, which became as one of the world's largest carbon market, and it was as one of the EU's flagship climate policy. It covered more than 10,000 facilities across Europe, and it followed a mechanism based on cap and trade model, which I just discussed. And the companies were also faced with hefty penalties if they were not meeting their allowances and going above and beyond that, which created a powerful incentives for companies to stay within their allocated limits. And this system was so successful in reducing emissions across Europe that the emissions from these sectors were decreased by nearly 40%. And the price of carbon allowances, because of the market demand, was steadily also rising, reaching over 80 euros per ton in the recent years, if you see the graph on the left. So because of the high cost of the emissions, all the industries were more and more encouraged to adopt cleaner practices, and this made carbon emission much more expensive, and industries eventually adopted more cleaner practices. So carbon border adjustment mechanism is also one of a significant regulatory measure that has been imposed by EU. The idea was to address the issue of carbon leakage and also ensure fair industry competition across industries in which who are subjected to ETS. So because they were part of the ETS, they had to pay very high incentive. They have to adopt cleaner practices, which of course increase the cost of production, or they had to pay to buy the emission allowances, which were also very, very expensive in the market. So in totality, the products produced out of EU were just more expensive and not competitive, cost competitive in the market. But other countries who were exporting products to EU were able to price their products much more competitively, because they did not have a similar structure, similar trading system in their countries. So they were becoming, the EU industries were subjected to unfair competition in the market. So the idea to also address this issue, and there was another issue that the EU industries realized that rather than just setting up a shop here in EU and paying such high penalties, let's just move from EU to other countries. So in the end, the whole objective of reducing carbon emission was being defeated across industries in EU. So to address this issue, CBAM has been proposed by EU. The underlying principle again of CBAM is to impose a carbon price on import of certain goods in from the countries that do not have a comparable carbon pricing systems. And they're also doing this to prevent the relocation of industries to regions with a little more lenient environmental regulations, and also protecting the competitiveness of European manufacturers in the global markets, because even when they will be exporting to other countries, they will not have a very competitive product, cost competitive product in the global market. So to start with, CBAM is focusing on some of the very high carbon intensive sectors, which include steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, and electricity. These are not just very important to Europe economy, but these are also the largest sources of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions globally. So this will follow a four-step phase. Right now, it is in a transitional phase. Exporters are not required to pay any carbon border tax, but they must report that the carbon content of their goods when they will be exporting to the EU. So this is kind of a transitional period. This will be followed by a full full implementation of CBAM, which will start from January 2026, which is the phase two, when the exporters will start paying the carbon taxes on aluminium, steel, and other products that I just listed. And eventually, after 2034, this CBAM will expand to other sectors, and new products will also be taken under the purview of CBAM. And phase four, which is 2034 onwards, all the goods and materials which will be imported to the EU will be subjected to CBAM. So these are the two. So this is my study is basically focusing that what will be the impact of CBAM on Indian industries. So the objective is to understand that, and this will help to understand the economic impact and what kind of measures can be taken by Indian businesses to reduce the carbon intensity and make their product equally cost competitive, and also focusing on what kind of approaches can be used. So to conduct this study, I have adopted a qualitative approach. I have studied various resources, various studies by consulting agencies, by trade organizations, by different nations, including EU and India. Also, data was gathered from Ministry of Commerce and Industry, which basically collects all the trade-related data for India. And they were I also have looked at various articles and basically papers from different journals which had talked about EU ETS and CBAM in detail. So after doing all my study, after going through all the secondary resources, I had also interacted with market experts and also the industries to understand their perspective on this initiative and how they think this will impact their businesses. So basically, to start with, what is the share? How much would it be an impact on a country like India on whole? The share of goods right now account for about basically share of goods which are exported to EU constitute around 10% of total exported goods from India, which is substantial. And India exports mainly iron and steel, aluminium, cement, and fertilizer to EU. Across this, aluminium and iron steel are the two biggest components which are exported from India to EU. So how this is going to affect the Indian businesses? The first thing would be definitely this will increase the cost for exporters. All the industries who are exporting to EU said that they will face higher costs because of the additional carbon price which will be imposed on their goods, and this will affect their competitiveness in the European markets. Of course, to the need for compliance, to maintain market access, they will have to invest in cleaner technologies and practices to comply with EU standards. And this will require substantial capital investment and technological innovation that is not really readily available in a country like India, which is still grappling up with other issues, and technology is not as readily available in as advanced stages that would be available to other countries, especially developed nations, and also the capital investment. The economic impact, especially the sectors who rely on carbon intensive processes, like I said, India is hugely dependent on coal, and also steel and cement industries, they will have to experience reduced profitability because of the carbon costs associated with CBAM. And this will also, because of higher costs, there is potential for job losses. The industries who will not be able to cope with these kind of changes will have to eventually close down, and they will either have to find new market opportunities, or they would have to completely shut down their operations. But this also leads to a biggest opportunity for India for investment in green technologies, which is one of the biggest priority also of India. The purpose is, of course, the reducing emissions will increase investment in renewable energy and other energy efficient technologies. So the implementation of CBAM, when I looked at the three products which are basically exported from India, aluminium, fertilizers, and iron and steel. So all these products combined account for about 50 million, account for about 5 million tons of weight. And because this is imposed on a ton basis, so this is important to see what is the weight of the total goods which are exported. So the value of all these CBAM covered goods is about 6,369 USD, and the emissions, if we would convert it based on emissions of these CBAM converted goods, would be about 116 million US dollars per ton CO2 emissions. And if I would look at in the terms of the what it will be the additional tax burden that will be imposed on these goods, it will range about 23% to 27% based on the 3-year data that I studied across these different products. So here the CBAM cost that I have taken is the 100 euros per ton, and this is going to lead to the CBAM cost. The additional CBAM cost will be about 1600 USD, so roughly around 1700 USD. So besides aluminium, steel, and iron and fertilizers, hydrogen is also under the purview of CBAM, which is currently not being exported to EU from India. But India has been positioning itself as an upcoming global hub for green hydrogen. So because hydrogen is also under the purview, I have also assessed that how competitive hydrogen would be in the context of CBAM. So while the country is not exporting, so EU has set some very significantly important standards for green hydrogen to ensure that the hydrogen which is imported or produced within other regions should contribute to the whole cause of net zero emission goals of EU. So very three important requirements set by EU includes additionality. They say that every green hydrogen produced in India or any other country should be using renewable power, which has renewable power from a plant which has been recently added into the grid. So for every green hydrogen that you're producing in India, I would just talk in an Indian context, this should lead to additional renewable energy plants. You cannot use old plants to produce renewable power, and that renewable power cannot be used to produce green hydrogen. The other very important requirement is the temporal correlation, that in every time block, so they have mentioned some time blocks. So for in every time block, when the renewable power will be produced, in the same time block, you have to make sure that green hydrogen is also produced. So initially, this will be on a monthly matching. So monthly matching would be that green hydrogen and renewable power should be produced within the same month. And this will transition to an hourly matching. So it should be produced, the renewable power and green hydrogen should be produced within the same hour, which will be imposed 2029 onwards. And before that, there will be a monthly matching. Then there is a geographical correlation that green hydrogen and renewable power should be produced within the same bidding zone. So India is a single bidding zone. EU is not. They're different countries, but India is a single bidding zone. So there is no issue in terms of that. But additionality is, of course, a difficult requirement. India would have to make sure the producers in green hydrogen who will be producing green hydrogen would have to make sure that they are setting up new renewable plants. And the second part, which is a temporal correlation, would be a very difficult challenge because of different kind of grid complexities involved in India. India allows monthly banking. So this will be continued even when the hourly matching will be imposed. So India allows the renewable project owners to bank their power and draw it from the grid within a month. But once this hourly matching will be imposed, it will be very difficult for the renewable power producers to match this requirement. And one of the very important and the key requirement imposed by EU is that they have capped the well-to-gate emissions, which includes the entire production process, including the raw material extraction, renewable power production to the final product at 3.4 kg CO2 per kg of hydrogen. Whereas in India, the emission standard set by Indian government is only 2 kg CO2 per kg of hydrogen, but this only includes the green hydrogen production part. So it does not matter if you are producing green hydrogen using renewable power or using thermal based power. So this kind of mismatch between the EU standards and the India standard would make a lot of confusion and would make the Indian producers in India not adhering to the standards of EU, because anything that would be classified as green hydrogen in India would not classify as green hydrogen in EU. So this gap in regulatory stringency may pose several issues. For example, there would be a limited market access. Indian producers who would be meeting domestic standards will not find their products to qualify for sale in EU, limiting their ability to export. There will be also perceived quality discrepancy. The lack of alignment with global standards would also create a perception that Indian products are not of that great of a quality and are of sustainable quality. And this could further diminish the marketability of Indian hydrogen in the international stage. And then, of course, the competitiveness in global trade. There are other nations also, like Australia or Chile, who have aligned their green hydrogen standards with EU requirements and not setting it similarly with Indians to global standards. India has put themselves at a competitive disadvantage, and failure to meet these international benchmarks will make Indian hydrogen less attractive for also to the other buyers in the countries. So to secure a foothold in the European market, Indian must take proactive measures to align its green hydrogen standards with the global norms. And this would not only involve the revising of the carbon emission thresholds, but also addressing the requirements related to additionality and correlation requirements that has been set by the EU. And by just upgrading the domestic standards, Indian producers can better position themselves to compete on the international stage and capitalize on the growing demand for clean energy solutions in EU market and also in other countries. There has been some criticism of CBAM, despite its well-intentioned goal of reducing carbon leakage and promoting global climate action. It has faced several criticism, particularly from developing countries. First is the protectionism allegations. One of the primary criticism of CBAM is that it is being considered as a tool of protectionism. Basically, experts are saying that the mechanism unfairly targets developing countries who are still dependent heavily on fossil fuels, countries like India, to sustain their economic growth. And these countries may view CBAM as a way for EU to protect their industries under the guise of climate action, and while placing additional financial burden on nations that are already grappling with developmental changes. The other issue that everybody also thinks that this will lead to some trade disputes. CBAM has the potential to trigger trade tensions between EU and other trading partners, including India. And the countries who heavily rely on exports to EU might view this mechanism as unjust trade barrier. This could also lead to dispute at international trade forums such as WTO, where affected countries might challenge CBAM with free trade principles, and India and China has already expressed concerns regarding this in these forums. And there is also implementation challenges for all the countries who do not have a similar system in India would find it very difficult. Indian businesses would find it very difficult to align their products with global countries, with the other countries' standards. And of course, the practical implementation of CBAM is going to be that the measuring of the emissions associated with the production of imported goods will present some significant challenges, because there may not be some tools available in India that EU would be using, and this would make also difficult for Indian businesses in India. Then there would be an inequity in transition, because, of course, economic precedence is environmental consideration is taking over economic precedence. CBAM is being criticized that it is failing to adequately account for the varying capacities of different countries to transition to low carbon emissions. Developing nations who have been dependent on fossil fuels face higher barriers to adopt cleaner technologies, and they may find it disproportionately difficult to comply with CBAM standards. And this mechanism does not provide any kind of room, any kind of flexibility for these countries who are under different kind of challenges, and they place undue pressure on these industries and economies. So, what would be the recommendations for different industries? While this is being contested in different forums by different countries, this is also representing a different kind of an opportunity for Indian businesses. India is one of the very blessed countries in terms of renewable resources. India produces one of the most lowest cost solar energy and wind energy. So there can be significant investments made by Indian businesses in renewable energies. Large industry players should go into different kind of power purchase agreements and invest in renewable products, because it's just not important at a global level, at a EU level, but also this helps the Indian businesses to reduce their power bills. So this is a no-brainer. This is the lowest hanging fruit for Indian businesses. By making investment in renewable energy, they're also helping themselves by reducing the cost of the energy consumption. Then focus on energy efficiency. Improving energy efficiency, another cost-effective strategy. India has already implemented a similar scheme of PAT scheme, which is Performance Achievement Rate scheme, which basically promotes energy efficiency across sectors in India. So this will not be a big challenge for Indian businesses, because they're already focusing on energy efficiency, and this is a very cost-effective strategy. This basically reduces your cost of energy again. Then electrification of Indian industrial processes. A lot of processes which are still reliant on fossil fuels, and since there is investment in renewable energy and the cost of electricity has gone down so significantly, electrifying some of the industrial processes would definitely reduce their emissions and also their power bills. Then there would also be they can be also investments in CCUS, which is a carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. This involves capturing the CO2 emissions from products and reducing the overall emissions from the production. And while this technology is still in early stages and it's a very expensive technology, there is still potential for industries to look for more innovation in this area, and how they can employ this at a more cost-effective way and reduce emissions. Last would be deploying a carbon market scheme at a domestic level. India is already looking at a domestic carbon market right now. They should expedite the deployment of this market. A well-functioning carbon market would help industries to adapt to global carbon pricing mechanisms, including CBAM, and this will also expose them to some kind of carbon cost and encourage emission reduction, and making them more prepared for this kind of measures being taken maybe in future also by other countries. And a national carbon market would provide a structured environment for companies to buy and sell carbon credits, and incentivize low carbon innovation, and align domestic policies with global standards. So this could also prepare Indian exporters to compete more effectively in markets with stringent carbon regulations. So in totality, so coming to the conclusion, as global markets evolve and EU has already implemented CBAM, this may not be the first of it. We are expecting more countries also to implement similar measures, and Indian industries will have to face these kind of challenges in maintaining their competitiveness at the global level. So this is a great opportunity for Indian businesses. While this add a significant cost burden, but this gives an opportunity to them which should be capitalized on by investing in renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and also looking at other advanced technologies such as CCUS, just we discussed. Indian companies can reduce emissions and enhance their global standing. And with the right kind of policy framework and industrial strategies, Indian government can also prepare the businesses in India and help them to grapple with the challenges that are related to CBAM and make them more adept to these kind of measures in future. And these proactive measures will also safeguard India's industries against the immediate impact of CBAM, and also position the country as a key player in the global low carbon economy, and ensure its industries also thrive in these kind of increasingly carbon constrained world. With this, I would like to end here. Thank you so much.